June 30, 2024, the day Venezuela called America's bluff. Let me tell you about the moment I realized we were witnessing something far more dangerous than another Latin American political crisis. It wasn't the headlines, those were Venezuela threatens Guyana, Maduro mobilizes troops, US warns of consequences. No, what made me sit up was the quiet, almost casual way the Venezuelan military began moving assets toward the Essequibo border, not in a frenzied rush, but with the methodical precision of a chess player who knows his opponent is running out of moves. I've spent the better part of 3 decades studying the intersection of resource politics, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American hegemony. And what's unfolding in Venezuela right now isn't just another regional dispute, it's a test case for whether the United States still has the will, the credibility, or even the basic competence to enforce its vision of global order. The problem? Nobody in Washington seems to have realized the game has already changed. The official what they want you to believe. If you've been following the mainstream coverage, here's the story: Venezuela, a rogue state under Nicolas Maduro, is making reckless territorial claims on Guyana's Essequibo region, a swath of land rich in oil, gold, and strategic depth. The U.S., as the guarantor of hemispheric stability, is duty-bound to respond. The State Department has issued stern warnings. The Pentagon has conducted joint military exercises with Guyana. The OAS has condemned Venezuela's aggression. And in a rare moment of bipartisan unity, Congress is debating sanctions and even the possibility of a limited military intervention to deter further escalation. The numbers seem to support this framing. Guyana's oil reserves, discovered by ExxonMobil in 2015, are now estimated at over 11 billion barrels, enough to make it the world's fastest-growing economy. Venezuela, by contrast, is a basket hyperinflation, mass immigration, and an economy that has shrunk by 75% since 2013. Maduro's regime is isolated, sanctioned, and desperate. His move on Essequibo, the narrative goes, is a last-ditch effort to rally nationalist support and distract from his own failures. The U.S. response is equally deterrence. The Biden administration has framed this as a test of American resolve. If Venezuela gets away with this, the logic goes, what's to stop China from seizing Taiwan, Russia from annexing more of Ukraine, or Iran from closing the Strait of Hormuz? The message is America still enforces the rules. But here's the problem with this: it's not true. Not the facts. Mind you, Venezuela is making a play for Essequibo, and Maduro is a thug. But the story we're being sold is a carefully curated half-truth, designed to justify a policy that has far more to do with Washington's internal politics and fading global dominance than with any genuine threat to regional stability. And if we don't see through it, we're sleepwalking into a crisis that could make Ukraine look like a warm-up act. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the most obvious: if Venezuela is so weak, why is it picking a fight with a U.S. ally? Maduro isn't stupid. He knows his military is a shadow of its former self, underfunded, demoralized, and reliant on Russian and Iranian support. He knows Guyana has the backing of ExxonMobil, the U.S. Southern Command, and, increasingly, the UK. So why provoke a confrontation that, by all conventional metrics, he can't win? The answer lies in 3: multipolarity, desperation, and leverage. First, multipolarity. The world is no longer unipolar. The U.S. can no longer dictate outcomes by sheer force of will. Venezuela knows that if it moves quickly enough, it can exploit the gaps in America's overstretched attention. The U.S. is bogged down in Ukraine, distracted by Taiwan, and politically paralyzed at home. Maduro's calculation? Washington won't risk a war over Guyana when it's already fighting proxy battles on 2 other continents. Second, desperation. Venezuela's economy is in freefall, but not for the reasons you think. Yes, U.S. sanctions have hurt, but the real damage comes from the collapse of the petrostate model. The world is transitioning away from oil, and Venezuela's heavy crude is increasingly uncompetitive. Maduro needs Essequibo's light sweet crude to survive. Without it, his regime faces economic oblivion. This isn't just about nationalism, it's about survival. Third, leverage. Maduro isn't just making a territorial grab, he's making a hostage play. He knows the U.S. wants Venezuelan oil back on the market to lower gas prices ahead of the 2024 election. He knows the Biden administration has been quietly negotiating with his regime for months, offering sanctions relief in exchange for democratic concessions. By escalating in Essequibo, Maduro is forcing the US to do you want to talk, or do you want to fight? And here's where it gets interesting. The US has already blinked. In October 2023, the Biden administration quietly lifted some sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in exchange for Maduro allowing limited opposition participation in elections. The deal was supposed to be a confidence-building measure. Instead, Maduro used the breathing room to consolidate power, arrest opposition leaders, and, you guessed it, double down on Essequibo. The message was you need me more than I need you. Now, the US is trapped. If it reimposes sanctions, oil prices spike, hurting Biden's re-election chances. If it does nothing, Maduro takes Essequibo and proves that American deterrence is a paper tiger. If it intervenes militarily, it risks a quagmire in a region where the US has a long history of failed interventions. This isn't incompetence. It's strategic incoherence, the inevitable result of a superpower trying to maintain global dominance on a shrinking budget. The geopolitical how Russia and China are playing the game. Let's out. What's happening in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the new Cold War, the one we're not supposed to call a Cold War, because that would admit the unipolar moment is over. Russia's role is the most obvious. Moscow has been propping up Maduro for years, supplying arms, intelligence, and economic lifelines. But this isn't just about ideology. Venezuela is Russia's foothold in America's backyard, a way to bleed the US in its own hemisphere. Every dollar Washington spends deterring Maduro is a dollar not spent countering Russia in Europe. Every US military asset tied down in the Caribbean is one less available for NATO's eastern flank. And here's the Russia isn't just supporting Venezuela, it's coordinating with it. In December 2023, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited Caracas and publicly endorsed Venezuela's claim to Essequibo. A few weeks later, Russian Wagner Group mercenaries were spotted in Guyana's border region ostensibly as private security for a gold mining operation, but more likely as a tripwire force. If the US or Guyana moves against Venezuela, those Wagner operatives could become a pretext for deeper Russian involvement. China's role is more subtle but no less dangerous. Beijing doesn't want a war in South America, it wants stability so it can extract resources. But it also sees Venezuela as a pressure point against the US. China has invested billions in Venezuelan oil infrastructure, and it's quietly buying up Guyana's crude at discounted rates. If Venezuela takes Essequibo, China gets first dibs on the new oil fields. If the US intervenes, China can frame it as American imperialism and rally global South support. But the real Chinese play is long-term. Beijing is betting that the US will eventually tire of policing the world and retreat into isolationism. When that happens, China wants to be the dominant power in Latin America, the way the US was in the 20th century. Venezuela is just the opening move. And then there's Iran. The Islamic Republic has been shipping drones, missiles, and oil smuggling expertise to Venezuela for years. In 2023, Iran and Venezuela signed a 20-year cooperation agreement, including joint military exercises. Why? Because Iran knows that if the US is distracted in South America, it has more room to maneuver in the Middle East. Every US carrier group sent to the Caribbean is one less available to deter Iran in the Persian Gulf. This is great power competition in action, not in the South China Sea or Eastern Europe, but in America's own neighborhood. And the US is losing. Military why this won't be a quick and easy war. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where the hawks in Washington are dangerously wrong. The US has two options if it wants to stop deterrence or force. Deterrence has already failed. Force is a nightmare. First, the logistics. Venezuela is 1,500 miles from the nearest major US base in Florida. Guyana has no deepwater ports, no air defense systems, and a military that's basically a coast guard with rifles. If the US wanted to invade, it would have to project power across the Caribbean, secure supply lines, and occupy a country the size of Britain with dense jungle, limited infrastructure, and a hostile population. Sound familiar? It should. This is Iraq 2003, but with worse terrain and no local allies. Second, the escalation risks. Venezuela has Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, Iranian drones, and a stockpile of ballistic missiles. It's not North Korea, but it's not Grenada either. If the US starts bombing Venezuelan positions, Maduro could retaliate by striking US bases in Colombia or Puerto Rico. He could unleash cyber attacks on American infrastructure. He could even, God forbid, sell oil to China in yuan, accelerating the dollar's decline as the world's reserve currency. Third, the political fallout. The US hasn't fought a major war in Latin America since the 1980s. The region is deeply suspicious of American interventionism. If the US invades Venezuela, it will be seen as a return to the dark days of the Monroe Doctrine. Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, all key US partners, would condemn the move. China and Russia would have a field day. And let's not forget the domestic angle. The American public has no appetite for another war. Biden's approval ratings are already in the toilet. If he starts a conflict in Venezuela, he hands Trump a golden opportunity to run as the peace candidate. The Pentagon knows this. The State Department knows this. But the political class is still trapped in the mindset of the 1990s, when the US could bomb a country and walk away unscathed. This won't be a surgical strike. It will be a quagmire. The domestic why Biden can't back down. Here's where things get really ugly. The Venezuela crisis isn't just about geopolitics, it's about American politics. Let's start with Florida. The state is a must-win for Biden in 2024, and it's home to over 1.5 million Venezuelan exiles who despise Maduro. If Biden looks weak on Venezuela, he loses their votes. If he takes a hard line, he risks alienating the progressive wing of his party, which is already skeptical of his foreign policy. Then there's the oil factor. Gas prices are a major drag on Biden's approval ratings. The administration has been quietly pressuring Venezuela to increase oil production to offset Russian sanctions. But if Maduro takes Essequibo, he controls even more oil and he'll use it as leverage to extract concessions from the US. If Biden caves, he looks weak. If he doesn't, gas prices stay high. And let's not forget the neoconservative wing of the Democratic Party. Figures like Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton have been pushing for a tougher line on Venezuela. They see this as a chance to prove that Democrats can be strong on national security. Never mind that their last strong intervention, Libya, turned a stable country into a failed state. The result? A policy that's all over the map. The US is simultaneously negotiating with Maduro, threatening him, and conducting military exercises with Guyana. It's a recipe for miscalculation. And here's the Trump is watching. If Biden stumbles in Venezuela, Trump will use it to argue that the US is weak under Democratic leadership. If Biden overreacts, Trump will say he's reckless. Either way, Venezuela becomes a wedge issue in the 2024 election. This isn't about strategy. It's about politics. Scenario how this ends. So where does this go? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case, a frozen conflict. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela reach a face-saving compromise. Maduro agrees to a temporary joint administration of Essequibo in exchange for sanctions relief. Guyana gets to keep most of the oil revenue, but Venezuela gets a cut. The US declares victory, Maduro survives, and the status quo limps on. The problem? This is unstable. Maduro will keep pushing. Guyana will keep resisting. And the US will be back in the same position in a year, but with even less credibility. Scenario 2, the most likely case, a slow-motion Cuban Missile Crisis. Venezuela takes a slice of Essequibo, maybe a few key oil fields, and dares the US to do something about it. The US responds with sanctions, cyber attacks, and covert support for opposition groups. Maduro retaliates by expelling US diplomats, arresting American citizens, and selling oil to China in yuan. The US and Venezuela enter a proxy war, with Guyana as the battleground. This is the most dangerous scenario because it's deniable. Neither side wants a direct war, but both are willing to escalate in the shadows. The risk? A miscalculation, a drone strike that kills the wrong people, a cyber attack that takes down a power grid, a naval incident in the Caribbean. Before you know it, you're in a shooting war. Scenario 3, the worst case, a regional war. Venezuela launches a full-scale invasion of Essequibo. The U.S. responds with airstrikes on Venezuelan military positions. Maduro declares a state of emergency and mobilizes his Russian-backed forces. Colombia and Brazil get dragged in. China and Russia increased their support for Venezuela. The U.S. finds itself fighting a two-front war, one in Europe, one in Latin America, while its economy is still recovering from inflation and its political system is paralyzed by polarization. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. Not because it's likely, but because it's plausible. And if it happens, the consequences will be catastrophic. The grand strategy why America keeps losing. Here's the Venezuela crisis is a symptom of a much larger problem. The United States is trying to maintain a global empire with the tools of a middle power. For 3 decades, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it can dictate the rules of the international system, that it can sanction, bomb, and regime change its way to global dominance. But the world has changed. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. The global South is no longer willing to accept American hegemony. And yet, Washington keeps making the same. 1. Overestimating its own power. The U.S. still thinks it can shape outcomes through military force. But in a multipolar world, hard power is less effective than ever. Venezuela knows the U.S. can invade. So it calls America's bluff. 2. Underestimating its adversaries. The U.S. assumes that Russia and China are paper tigers, that they'll back down when confronted. But they're not. They're playing the long game. And they're winning. 3. Ignoring the domestic cost. The American public is exhausted. It doesn't want more wars. It doesn't want more debt. It doesn't want more inflation. But the foreign policy establishment keeps pushing for intervention, because that's what it knows how to do. This isn't just a failure of policy. It's a failure of grand strategy. The U.S. is still operating under the assumptions of the unipolar moment, when it could act with impunity. But that moment is over. And if we don't adapt, we're going to keep losing. What should we do instead? So what's the alternative? How do we avoid a disaster in Venezuela and, more importantly, how do we stop repeating the same mistakes? First, stop pretending we can dictate outcomes. The U.S. needs to accept that it no longer has the power to impose its will on the world. That doesn't mean isolationism, it means realism. We need to prioritize our core interests and stop trying to police the world. Second, use diplomacy, not threats. The U.S. should be engaging with Venezuela not to reward Maduro, but to manage the crisis. That means back-channel negotiations, economic incentives, and a clear off-ramp for both sides. It means working with Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico to contain the conflict, rather than trying to go it alone. Third, stop the sanctions addiction. Sanctions don't work. They hurt civilians, strengthen regimes, and push countries into the arms of China and Russia. If we want to change Venezuela's behavior, we need to offer carrots, not just sticks. Fourth, prepare for a multipolar world. The U.S. needs to accept that China and Russia are here to stay. That doesn't mean surrender, it means competition. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's defiance isn't just about oil or ideology, it's about the slow-motion collapse of America's military deterrence in its own backyard. The Pentagon has spent decades treating Latin America as a secondary theater, a place where the U.S. could project power at will through coups, sanctions, or the occasional naval blockade. But that era is ending, and Venezuela is the test case. Let me explain why this matters. In 2019, when the U.S. recognized Juan Guaido as Venezuela's interim president, the Trump administration assumed Maduro would collapse under the weight of sanctions and diplomatic isolation. Instead, Maduro dug in, and the U.S. found itself in a bind. Military intervention was off the table not just because of domestic fatigue, but because the risks had become too high. The U.S. Southern Command, which oversees operations in Latin America, has been warning for years about the growing influence of Russia and China in the region. In 2020, Russian military aircraft landed in Venezuela to deliver supplies, and in 2022, Moscow deployed nuclear-capable bombers to the country for joint exercises. Meanwhile, China has been quietly extending its military footprint, including a reported signals intelligence facility in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. Here's the uncomfortable: the US no longer has a monopoly on hard power in the Western Hemisphere. And Venezuela knows it. Maduro's regime has been systematically deepening its ties with America's adversaries, not just as a political statement, but as a strategic hedge. In 2023, Venezuela signed a military cooperation agreement with Iran, including joint naval patrols in the Caribbean. That same year, Russia announced plans to establish a permanent naval base in Venezuela, a move that would give Moscow a foothold in the Atlantic. These aren't just symbolic gestures, they're direct challenges to U.S. dominance in a region Washington has long considered its sphere of influence. The problem isn't just that the U.S. is losing leverage, it's that it's losing the ability to shape the battlefield. During the Cold War, the U.S. could rely on a network of bases, proxy forces, and economic coercion to keep adversaries in check. Today, those tools are either ineffective or counterproductive. Sanctions on Venezuela haven't toppled Maduro, they've pushed him closer to Russia and China. Diplomatic pressure hasn't isolated him, it's forced him to diversify his alliances. And military threats? They've only made him more defiant. What's worse is that the U.S. foreign policy establishment still hasn't internalized this shift. In 2023, when Venezuela held a referendum to annex the oil-rich Essequibo region from Guyana, the U.S. responded with a show of force, sending a guided missile destroyer to the region and conducting joint military exercises with Guyana. But Maduro didn't back down. Instead, he escalated, announcing plans to establish a military base in the disputed territory. The message was Venezuela is willing to call America's bluff, and it knows the U.S. won't risk a direct confrontation. This isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader erosion of U.S. military primacy. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy identified China as the pacing threat and Russia as an acute danger, but it failed to account for how these adversaries are working together to undermine U.S. influence in the global south. In Venezuela, Russia provides military support, China offers economic lifelines, and Iran supplies drones and intelligence. This isn't a formal alliance, but it doesn't need to be. It's a loose coalition of revisionist powers, each with its own interests, but all united in their desire to weaken American hegemony. The question: what happens when deterrence fails? The U.S. has spent decades preparing for a war with China in the South China Sea or a conflict with Russia in Eastern Europe. But it hasn't prepared for a scenario where its adversaries chip away at its influence in its own neighborhood, one crisis at a time. Venezuela is the canary in the coal mine, a warning that the U.S. can no longer assume it can dictate outcomes in its backyard. So where does this leave us? The first step is recognizing that the old playbook no longer works. Military posturing without a clear endgame only emboldens adversaries. Sanctions without off-ramps only deepen their reliance on alternative patrons. And diplomatic isolation only pushes them into the arms of those who are willing to engage. The second step is accepting that the U.S. needs a new approach, one that combines deterrence with diplomacy, coercion with incentives, and hard power with smart power. That means working with regional partners like Brazil and Colombia to contain Venezuela's worst impulses, rather than trying to go it alone. It means offering Maduro a way out, perhaps through sanctions relief in exchange for democratic concessions, rather than demanding his unconditional surrender. And it means preparing for a world where the U.S. no longer has the luxury of acting unilaterally. The third step is the admitting that the U.S. can't have it all. For decades, American foreign policy has operated on the assumption that the U.S. can maintain global dominance while avoiding the costs of empire. But that's no longer sustainable. The U.S. needs to prioritize its core interests, protecting its homeland, securing its supply chains, and maintaining its alliances rather than trying to police every crisis around the world. Venezuela isn't just a problem to be solved, it's a symptom of a larger shift. The U.S. is no longer the sole superpower, and the sooner it accepts that, the better it can adapt. The alternative is a world where America's adversaries keep pushing the boundaries, one crisis at a time, until the US finds itself in a fight it never wanted and can't win. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's defiance isn't just about Maduro's stubbornness, it's about the structural collapse of the domestic political order that once made the country a functional, if flawed, democracy. The 1999 Constitution, drafted under Chavez, was supposed to be a radical reimagining of Venezuelan governance, a participatory democracy that would empower the poor and break the grip of the old elite. But what it actually did was concentrate power in the executive to an unprecedented degree. The National Assembly was neutered, the judiciary was packed, and the Electoral Council was turned into a rubber stamp. By the time Maduro inherited this system in 2013, the institutions that could have checked his power were already hollowed out. Let me explain why this matters. When the opposition won a supermajority in the 2015 parliamentary elections, the first real electoral rebuke to Chavismo in years, Maduro didn't just ignore the result. He had the Supreme Tribunal of Justice, stacked with loyalists, declare the National Assembly in contempt and strip it of its legislative powers. When the opposition tried to hold a recall referendum in 2016, the Electoral Council, led by Tibisay Lucena, delayed and obstructed the process until it was effectively dead. And when the opposition boycotted the 2018 presidential election, widely condemned as fraudulent by the Lima Group, the EU, and even the OAS, Maduro didn't just win. He won with 67% of the vote in an election where turnout was barely 46%, the lowest in Venezuela's modern history. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's political system isn't just authoritarian, it's a zombie democracy. The institutions still exist on paper, but they've been drained of any real meaning. The National Assembly that Maduro's allies now control is a shell of its former self, passing laws that are never enforced. The opposition parties that once mobilized millions in the streets are fractured, with some leaders in exile, others in prison, and still others co-opted by the regime. The military, which has historically been the arbiter of Venezuelan politics, is now so deeply embedded in the economy, controlling everything from food distribution to gold mining, that it has no incentive to defect. And the people? They're exhausted. The protests that once filled Caracas's streets have dwindled, not because Venezuelans support Maduro, but because they've lost faith in the idea that change can come from within. So what happens next? The most likely scenario is what I call authoritarian stasis, a kind of frozen conflict where Maduro remains in power, the opposition remains divided, and the country limps along in a state of permanent crisis. The regime has already shown it can survive hyperinflation, mass emigration, and international sanctions. It's even found ways to profit from the chaos, whether through gold smuggling to Turkey, oil shipments to China and India, or cryptocurrency schemes that bypass the US financial system. The US and its allies can keep tightening the screws: more sanctions, more diplomatic isolation, more support for Juan Guaido's ghost government, but without a credible threat of military intervention or a unified opposition that can actually challenge Maduro at the ballot box, the status quo is likely to persist. But there are other scenarios, and none of them are pretty. The first is a slow-motion collapse, where the regime's grip on power weakens but never quite breaks. This could look like a series of localized uprisings, think the 2019 protests, but smaller and more frequent, that the security forces brutally suppress. Or it could look like a gradual fragmentation of the state, where regional strongmen start acting more like warlords than bureaucrats. The second scenario is a sudden implosion, triggered by something like a military coup, a mass defection of the National Guard, or even an assassination attempt on Maduro. This would plunge the country into chaos, but it wouldn't necessarily lead to a democratic transition. More likely, it would result in a power struggle between hardliners and the regime, with the military calling the shots behind the. The third scenario, and the one that keeps me up at night, is what I call Cubanization. This is where Venezuela becomes a fully fledged client state of Russia, China, and Iran, a kind of Latin American North Korea. We're already seeing the early Russian Wagner Group mercenaries training Venezuelan troops, Chinese state-owned commies taking over oil fields, and Iranian-backed militias operating in the shadows. If Maduro feels truly cornered, he might double down on this alliance, turning Venezuela into a platform for anti-American operations in the hemisphere. Imagine a world where Hezbollah cells operate freely in Margarita Island, where Russian intelligence runs disinformation campaigns from Caracas, and where Chinese warships dock in Venezuelan ports. That's not a dystopian fantasy, it's a plausible outcome if the US and its allies don't adjust their strategy. Now, let's talk about the opposition, because this is where the real tragedy lies. For years, the US and its allies have treated the Venezuelan opposition as a monolith, a unified force that just needs a little more support to topple Maduro. But the reality is far messier. The opposition is a fractured coalition of parties, factions, and personalities, each with their own agendas and grievances. Leopoldo Lopez, the Harvard-educated firebrand, has spent years in prison and house arrest, while Juan Guaidó, the self-proclaimed interim president, has seen his popularity plummet as his promises of regime change have failed to materialize. Enrique Capriles, the two-time presidential candidate, has been sidelined by the hardliners, while Maria Corina Machado, the most popular opposition figure in recent polls, has been banned from running for office. The problem isn't just that the opposition is divided, it's that it's been outmaneuvered at every turn. Maduro has used a combination of repression, co-optation, and divide-and-rule tactics to keep his enemies off balance. When the opposition boycotts elections, he accuses them of being undemocratic. When they participate, he changes the rules to ensure they lose. When they protest, he sends in the colectivos, armed pro-government gangs, to crack down. And when they try to negotiate, he drags out the process until their supporters lose faith. The 2021 Barbados talks, mediated by Norway, were the latest example. The opposition agreed to participate in regional elections in exchange for the release of political prisoners and guarantees for a free and fair presidential vote in 2024. But Maduro reneged on the deal, releasing only a handful of prisoners and banning Machado from running. Here's the opposition's failures aren't just tactical, they're existential. They've never really answered the fundamental what comes after Maduro. The hardliners talk about a democratic transition, but they've never explained how that would work in a country where the military controls the economy, the judiciary is packed with loyalists, and the state has collapsed. The moderates talk about a negotiated solution, but they've never explained how they'd convince Maduro to step down without offering him and his cronies immunity from prosecution. And the international community? It's been happy to cheer from the sidelines, but it's never really put its money where its mouth is. The US has imposed sanctions, but it's never offered a clear pathway to sanctions relief. The EU has condemned the regime, but it's never really threatened to cut off the oil imports that keep Maduro afloat. So where does this leave us? The most realistic outcome is a prolonged stalemate, where Maduro remains in power but the country continues to decay. The economy will keep shrinking, the population will keep shrinking, and the regime will keep finding ways to survive. The opposition will keep trying to unify, but it will keep failing. And the international community will keep wringing its hands, but it won't do anything decisive. But there's another possibility, one that's rarely discussed in Washington or Brussels. What if the US and its allies stopped treating Venezuela as a problem to be solved and started treating it as a reality to be managed? What if, instead of demanding Maduro's unconditional surrender, they offered him a way out, sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections, a gradual reintegration into the international financial system, and guarantees for his safety? What if, instead of trying to isolate Venezuela, they engaged with it, offering humanitarian aid, investment, and technical assistance in exchange for political reforms? I know what but Maduro is a dictator. He's a criminal. He doesn't deserve a way out. And you're right. But here's the diplomacy isn't about morality, it's about pragmatism. The US has negotiated with far worse regimes in the past. It negotiated with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It negotiated with North Korea over its nuclear program. It negotiated with the Taliban in Afghanistan. And it's currently negotiating with Iran over its nuclear program. So why not Venezuela? The answer, of course, is politics. The US has spent years portraying Maduro as a pariah, a narco-dictator who must be removed at all costs. Any suggestion of engagement is immediately attacked as appeasement or legitimizing a tyrant. But here's the uncomfortable: the current approach isn't working. Sanctions have hurt the Venezuelan people, but they haven't toppled Maduro. Diplomatic isolation has pushed him into the arms of Russia and China, but it hasn't weakened his grip on power. And military intervention is off the table, not just because it's politically toxic, but because it's strategically unwise. So what's the alternative? The US and its allies need to start thinking differently. They need to recognize that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and that the best they can hope for is a managed transition, one that avoids a sudden collapse, preserves some semblance of stability, and gives the Venezuelan people a real say in their future. That means engaging with the regime, not just the opposition. It means offering carrots, not just sticks. And it means accepting that the road to democracy in Venezuela will be long, messy, and uncertain. But here's the: if the US and its allies don't change course, they'll be left with a choice between two bad options. The first is a Venezuela that remains a failed state, a source of instability in the region, and a haven for criminal and anti-American actors. The second is a Venezuela that collapses into chaos, triggering a humanitarian crisis that makes the current exodus look like a trickle. Neither of these outcomes is in anyone's interest. So let's be the old playbook is dead. The question is whether the US and its allies are willing to write a new one.